What if a single molecule could both rewire your brain and completely unravel your sense of self? In the body, psilocybin is quickly converted into psilocin, which binds mainly to 5-HT2A receptors, sites normally tuned to serotonin. This small change sets off effects that ripple across the brain in ways scientists are still trying to map. By 2025, new research shows this same mechanism is reshaping how we think about depression, consciousness, and lasting brain change. Yet the very pathways that heal can also open doors to frightening states. To understand why, we need to look at its surprising history. Psilocybin's ancient role versus modern spotlight. Why has a substance, once consumed in solemn rituals, more than 1,000 years ago, now become one of the most discussed topics in neuroscience conferences of 2025? Psilocybin, found in specific mushrooms, has traveled from ancient temples to modern clinical laboratories. In earlier times, these mushrooms were used as instruments for spiritual encounters, often guided by shamans, healers, or community leaders who framed the experience with ritual, songs, and intention. The point was never simple recreation. It was a structured, communal, and deeply meaningful engagement with states of consciousness that were seen as extraordinary. Anthropological evidence shows these practices stretching across regions, with particularly strong documentation in Central and South America and scattered suggestions elsewhere. Across cultures, the central theme was consistent. Psilocybin facilitated an entryway into visions that were believed to carry healing, insight, or guidance for the people involved. In today's context, those same experiences have been reframed within sterile hospital rooms, research centers, and psychiatric clinics. Instead of chants and smoke-filled caves, psilocybin, now measured in precise milligrams, purified and encapsulated, is administered to carefully screened patients who lie inside MRI machines or sit with trained therapists. Scientists speak not of gods or spirits, but of receptor subtypes, brain networks, and trial outcomes. The shift may look radical, yet both ancient ritual and modern laboratory share a parallel goal: to reduce human suffering and to open doors to insights that everyday consciousness does not provide. Whether wrapped in sacred symbolism or in the language of neuroscience, psilocybin retains its role as a catalyst for profound psychological events. The tension between those two worlds, sacred ritual and clinical procedure, defines much of the current debate. In traditional settings, visions were considered revelations from outside the self. In the language of contemporary research, they are reconfigurations of perception triggered by a molecule binding to serotonin receptors. Neither view dismisses the power of what participants undergo. The interpretations diverge, but in both contexts the alteration of awareness is considered meaningful and potentially transformative. This parallel becomes especially clear when noting that modern clinical trials almost always include guided therapeutic support during the psilocybin session. Just as ancient rituals relied on a shaman to frame and guide the experience, psychiatric research in 2025 pairs psilocybin with structured psychotherapy to help patients prepare, process, and integrate their sessions. The continuity here is striking and shows that while the cultural frame has changed, the recognition of the need for guidance has remained constant. The regulatory landscape reveals another layer of complexity. Unlike many conventional medicines, psilocybin remains a federally controlled Schedule I substance in the United States, the classification reserved for compounds considered to have no accepted medical use. At the same time, the Food and Drug Administration has granted expedited designations for certain psilocybin trials and signaled an openness to accelerate clinical research timelines if data continue to look promising. Other jurisdictions have gone further. In 2023, Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration approved tightly regulated clinical use of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression under specialist supervision. This uneven landscape underscores how quickly perceptions of psilocybin are shifting, though any suggestion of full approval at the federal level remains premature. The potential impact explains why regulators are watching closely. Major depressive disorder that resists conventional treatments often leaves patients with limited options. Preliminary clinical trials suggest that, under careful conditions, even a single or limited number of psilocybin-assisted sessions can reduce symptoms for weeks or months. The significance rests not in unrestrained enthusiasm, but in evidence. Participants monitored in well-structured studies have reported measurable improvements in mood and outlook compared to control groups. Researchers emphasize that psilocybin is not acting alone, the structured therapy surrounding the sessions is central to its effectiveness. This cautious and data-driven process is very different from the uncontrolled recreational use that has led to misconceptions in the past. The contrast with other psychiatric medications is also notable. Antidepressants commonly prescribed today are synthesized by pharmaceutical laboratories and taken daily, often for years. Psilocybin, by contrast, is derived from naturally occurring mushrooms already recognized by ethnobotanists in over 200 species worldwide. Rather than requiring daily intake, current trials examine whether occasional high-impact sessions can bring lasting benefits when combined with therapy. In that sense, psilocybin represents an entirely different model of psychiatric intervention, one that challenges established assumptions about how medicines are supposed to work. Public attitudes towards psilocybin continue to evolve unevenly. For decades, most societies treated its use as superstition, danger, or even criminal activity. Governments prohibited its possession and research, largely in reaction to counterculture associations more than medical evidence. Now, the very same compound once dismissed is being explored as a legitimate therapy that could address unmet psychiatric needs. The whiplash raises difficult questions. Did earlier prohibitions reflect the risks accurately, or did they suppress potentially helpful knowledge because the experiences fell outside cultural comfort zones? And on the other side, is the current wave of enthusiasm moving too quickly, giving psilocybin a reputation as an automatic miracle cure before longer-term data are available? The truth, as critics often suggest, probably lies somewhere between those extremes. The irony of psilocybin's dual identity is unmistakable. A molecule that ancient participants believed connected them with gods and ancestors is at the same time a compound now plotted on receptor-binding charts and quantified in clinical outcome measures. The molecule itself has not altered. What has changed is the interpretive frame through which humans encounter it. Ancient communities viewed the visions as external messages. Modern neuroscience frames them as consequences of modulating serotonin pathways. One speaks of other realms, the other speaks of neural networks. Yet both describe the same human brain, responding to the same molecule in ways that remain difficult to fully explain. As psilocybin moves into the spotlight of official trials and cautious regulatory experiments, its story embodies one of the most unusual intersections between culture and science. Seeing the same compound treated as a doorway to divine realms in one millennium, and as a candidate for FDA-supervised trials in another highlights just how broadly human experience can shape interpretation. What unites these very different eras is the recognition that psilocybin alters perception in ways that feel significant and life-changing to those who go through it. That cultural and scientific overlap keeps the discussion alive and keeps research moving forward with high stakes for mental health. All of this background sets us up with a central question. If this one molecule carries such extraordinary cultural weight and now such therapeutic promise, how does it actually operate inside the brain to generate those experiences? Understanding that requires attention to its biological journey. And that is where modern neuroscience is now focused. What happens in your brain when psilocybin arrives? How does a compound measured in milligrams manage to shift something as intricate as human consciousness? That is the puzzle at the core of psilocybin research. A single mushroom cap contains only trace amounts of its active ingredient, yet once ingested, those molecules can reverberate through perception, memory, and mood in unexpected ways. To understand why, we need to trace the compound's path from raw chemistry to large-scale changes in brain activity. The first step is metabolism. Psilocybin itself is not the substance directly responsible for hallucinations or shifts in awareness. As soon as it enters the body, enzymes in the liver remove a phosphate group, converting psilocybin into psilocin. That modification allows the compound to slip through the blood-brain barrier and interact directly with key signaling systems inside the brain. After ingestion, psilocybin is dephosphorylated into psilocin, which binds 5-HT receptors concentrated in cortical areas and the default mode network. That binding is associated with acute desynchronization and increased crosstalk between regions. In short, the interaction begins at a single type of receptor, but the ripple extends outward into entire functional circuits. These receptors are normally occupied by serotonin, the neurotransmitter that helps regulate mood, sensory processing, and emotional balance. Psilocin, however, resembles serotonin closely, enough to secure a spot at the same site. Once bound, though, the receptor no longer follows its usual rhythm. Instead, signaling becomes less predictable, triggering wide-ranging disruptions in brain communication. Because 5-HT2A receptors are particularly dense in regions critical for self-reflection, sensory integration, and narrative thinking, psilocybe's grip alters precisely the hubs that support our sense of self and how we experience reality. The reach of these changes is surprisingly broad. When normal signaling in the default mode network is disrupted, the constant background chatter of self-awareness can grow faint. At the same time, regions that rarely coordinate, such as visual areas linking up with memory circuits, begin to exchange information more freely. The result is often a flood of novel associations, altered perceptions, and in some cases the feeling that the distinction between self and world has dissolved. A microscopic binding event, repeated across billions of neurons, creates macroscopic changes in how consciousness is experienced. Yet the subjective range of experiences remains one of the greatest mysteries. Two individuals may take the same dose, activating the same receptors in comparable regions, but one emerges describing expansive clarity, while the other is overwhelmed by chaotic visions. Differences likely reflect baseline brain connectivity, set and setting, and downstream signaling bias. Not a failure of the receptor model. All areas still under active research. These complex factors remind researchers that the brain is not a uniform canvas, but a landscape mapped differently in every person, and psilocybin's impact plays out against that unique backdrop. To investigate these divergent responses more rigorously, scientists have turned to neuroimaging. In earlier decades, researchers relied mainly on self-reports or animal data. But in 2025, brain scans using technologies like functional MRI provide direct evidence of what is happening. Images consistently show regions that typically stay in their own functional lanes beginning to interact. The visual cortex can send information to networks involved in autobiographical memory, or sensory areas may suddenly converse with emotional regulators. These unusual pathways signal that the brain is temporarily reorganizing into an unusually flexible state. Researchers often describe this as increased global connectivity, or crosstalk, across regions that are usually segregated. Importantly, this does not unfold as random noise. Connectivity strengthens along certain atypical routes, while the dominance of typical pathways fades temporarily. Such restructuring explains why participants report experiences ranging from a release of rigid thought patterns to the sudden overlay of sensory mosaics across familiar memories. What appears chaotic in subjective accounts is underpinned by a patterned, although unusual, reorganization of neural traffic. The dynamics of these changes evolve over the course of hours. Early in a session, broad and rapid disruption spreads across networks, sometimes creating vivid surges of sensory imagery. Later, activity often stabilizes into phases where the brain explores alternative wiring, forming temporary connections before returning to baseline. These dynamic shifts may determine whether the final subjective outcome of the session feels structured and revelatory or destabilizing and fragmented. In this sense, time itself is an important factor, with the unfolding course shaping the meaning participants attach to their experience. One of the most intriguing findings concerns the temporary quieting of the default mode network. Often likened to an inner narrator, it keeps the story of I running in the background, my goals, my identity, my problems. Under psilocybin, that narration softens. Simultaneously, sensory and emotional areas communicate more freely, creating what many describe as a sense of unity with the environment or dissolution of boundaries between self and world. For some, this is experienced as profound transcendence. For others, the loss of a stable inner anchor spurs fear and confusion. Both outcomes stem from the same suppression of habitual self-reference. Adding further depth to the picture, recent animal and large animal studies suggest psilocybin may support neuroplasticity. In mice, researchers have observed rapid formation of dendritic spines, while pig models show increases in presynaptic density markers, such as SV2A, in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex after a single dose. These findings hint at a capacity for psilocybin to encourage new neural connections, a potential biological basis for the long-lasting shifts reported by some participants. However, scientists emphasize that translating this into human timelines and clinical outcomes remains an open question. Evidence for neuroplastic changes in humans is still emerging and must be mapped carefully before firm claims are possible. What distinguishes psilocybin from other psychoactive drugs is this dual action. Immediate receptor-level changes sparking acute network rewiring, and possible longer-term plasticity effects that may solidify new patterns. Traditional antidepressants usually work by modulating neurotransmitter levels consistently over weeks or months. Psilocybin, in contrast, seems to transiently destabilize entrenched loops, allowing different circuits to form connections they rarely attempt. The session itself may be brief, but the traces it leaves behind, either beneficial or disruptive, can last far longer. So while we can clearly track psilocybe's conversion, binding, and network effects, translating that into the subjective worlds people describe remains unresolved. Neuroimaging has gone a long way toward revealing mechanisms, but linking scans directly to personal narratives still escapes clear definition. What scientists do agree on is that the pattern is not one of simple chaos. Rather, psilocybin temporarily reorders the brain's communication, enhancing unlikely connections while silencing dominant pathways, leaving a landscape of both heightened entropy and structured coordination. Those patterns hold enormous therapeutic potential, but they also raise new dangers. Enhanced connectivity can free someone from the grip of long-standing depressive thought loops, or it can lead to sensory overload and panic when unstructured. Understanding this fine balance is what makes psilocybin such an unusual subject for neuroscience. It can liberate or destabilize depending on context, preparation, and individual variation. The same reorganization that produces breakthroughs also carries the seeds of frightening disorientation, a balance that frames the next pressing question about this molecule's power: boosting brain connections or scrambling them. Here's the crux: the same shift in brain activity that can free someone from years of depressive rumination can also tip another person into distress and panic. Psilocybin's influence is not inherently safe or unsafe. It depends on the context where the experience unfolds. In clinical research settings, increased connectivity between networks often allows patients to escape entrenched loops of thought. In uncontrolled environments, that same disinhibition can scramble perception and produce overwhelming anxiety. The difference lies in how the brain's newly flexible communication channels are channeled when they open. Under ordinary conditions, the brain's networks operate in highly specialized roles. The visual cortex processes sight, the auditory cortex sound, while the default mode network helps maintain the ongoing sense of self. These networks typically run in parallel with limited overlap to avoid confusion. Psilocybin disrupts that arrangement. Subsystems that are usually separate start to cross-communicate, producing signals that bleed into one another. Psychologists call this network flexibility. The mind becomes less locked into its usual patterns and more willing to try out alternative connections, associations, and perspectives. For someone caught in depressive cycles, this shift is like suddenly finding the scratched record, no longer skipping. It hops paths instead of repeating the same refrain. That temporary freedom can feel like a profound opening. This is where the therapeutic appeal lies. By interrupting rigid communication loops, psilocybin creates room for new patterns to emerge. Patients often describe the experience as if a mental burden has been lifted, or that they've been granted access to fresh ways of thinking they couldn't previously imagine. In clinical trials, these moments often translate into lasting improvements, a sense of lightness or flexibility that persists weeks after the chemical itself has left the body. Rather than shallow euphoria, the benefits look linked to genuine changes in brain signaling, with connectivity reconfigured into more adaptive patterns. But the same loosened structure is also the root of danger in unsafe settings. When networks begin to talk without limits, the brain is bombarded with an overload of information. Without trained guides or a safe environment, that flood can turn into chaos. A person may be confronted by hallucinations they cannot integrate, an internal dissolution they cannot manage, or a panic that builds as the mind searches for footing and finds none. Instead of liberating, the connectivity feels all-consuming, like trying to listen when every channel on a radio plays through the same loudspeaker at once. Think of the brain like radio stations. Psilocybin temporarily turns the dial, so many stations overlap. Guided contexts can turn that overlap into harmony, while chaotic settings make it noise. This one difference, supportive framing versus uncontrolled environment, can determine whether heightened network crosstalk brings clarity or distress. The science shows the molecule is not two-faced, it is the same process yielding different outcomes depending on the context. Neuroscience finds the psychedelic state raises brain entropy, the brain's activity becomes less predictable and networks talk more. And that spike in unpredictability is what can enable new perspectives or cause disorientation. In one setting, the increased variability feels like a broadened mental horizon. In another, it collapses into confusion. This concise lens of entropy captures why subjective accounts can swing between transcendence and terror so easily. Clinical trials highlight how deliberate structure mitigates the risks. Clinical protocols pair dosing with preparatory sessions, 2 guides during the session, and structured integration afterward. This human scaffold is what turns high-entropy brain states into therapeutic opportunity. Patients are not just given psilocybin, they are given context, reassurance, and tools for meaning-making. The guides do not tell participants what to experience, but they provide the grounding presence that helps keep fear from spiraling when perception becomes unpredictable. The picture is very different outside the lab. Recreational users often lack any form of integration, and a chaotic trip may leave unresolved fragments lingering as anxiety or unease. Scientific evidence suggests that when the brain's activity destabilizes and then resettles with therapeutic support, the result can be long-term improvements in mood. But when destabilization occurs without preparation or follow-up, the reorganization may take on less helpful forms. The outcome is not controlled by the compound itself, but by what surrounds it: expectation, environment, guidance, and integration. This framing helps explain the paradoxical reports that often make psilocybin seem impossible to categorize. To many participants in clinical trials, the experience feels like an awakening or emotional release. To others in unstructured contexts, the same dose can dissolve into panic-laden confusion. The duality is not a matter of different drugs or different chemistry. It is the brain reacting to concentrated unpredictability and making sense of it differently depending on circumstance. Researchers caution against leaning too far toward either pole: the miracle cure narrative or the dangerous hallucinogen narrative. Both miss the essential point. Psilocybin alters neural patterns by increasing connectivity and entropy. Those changes do not guarantee healing or harm. The deciding factor is the conditions under which the reorganization plays out. Without guardrails, the variability can scatter meaning. With them, it can channel insight. Viewed this way, psilocybin resembles a catalyst rather than a standalone cure, an agent that temporarily suspends the brain's ordinary order. Stability is necessary for everyday function, but occasional controlled bursts of disorganization can create the openings needed to reset embedded patterns. The human brain is not designed for perpetual high entropy. Rather, short periods of altered communication can permit a reconfiguration that settles back into healthier baseline states. That temporary expansion underlies both the mystical descriptions people share and the more clinical reports of ruminative loops disrupted. The paradox is resolved in recognizing psilocybin's effects as one biological process with multiple outcomes. The increased crosstalk and unpredictability can feel like revelation or like collapse depending on support, setting, and personal readiness. This is why researchers emphasize the importance of structured clinical frameworks. They do not just administer the compound, they shape the entire environment so the brain's temporary variability can lead to constructive rather than destabilizing results. With that scientific foundation in mind, the next pressing question is whether these striking shifts in brain dynamics actually translate into measurable improvements for patients. Beyond metaphors of radio dials or entropy, what do the numbers reveal when psilocybin is tested against one of the most pressing psychiatric conditions of our time? Depression breakthroughs and the 2025 numbers. Can a handful of guided sessions with psilocybin really rival years of daily reliance on antidepressant pills? That question has defined much of the recent research into treatment-resistant depression. And by 2025, trials large enough to provide reliable comparisons are finally delivering answers. The picture is not simple, but it is clearer. Results point to meaningful possibilities for patients who have not responded to standard antidepressants, though the effects are variable and far from universal. For decades, depression treatment centered on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs. These medications altered brain chemistry gradually, often over weeks, but many people never experienced relief. A subgroup categorized as treatment-resistant, individuals who had tried multiple antidepressant regimens without improvement, have remained especially difficult to treat. For this population, stability often felt unreachable, and the cycle of patient and provider frustration stretched on for years. Because of that, psilocybin research has concentrated heavily on this group, where even partial success would signify an important advance. The research journey began cautiously. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, small pilot trials brought psilocybin into carefully designed therapeutic contexts. Participant numbers were often limited, but the changes reported in mood and outlook captured scientists' attention. By the early 2020s, replication across multiple sites and an emphasis on pairing psilocybin with structured psychotherapy laid the groundwork for broader studies. Now, in 2025, much larger, multi-site clinical trials are showing reliable signals that go beyond early anecdotes. What stands out most are the numbers from these expanded trials. Across recent, larger studies and pooled analyses, many psilocybin treatment arms reported substantial response and remission rates. For example, pooled active arm response rates in some meta-analyses have landed near the high 40% range at short-term follow-up. Placebo or control groups showed much smaller gains, underscoring that the effects were not simply due to expectation or suggestibility. Reported remission rates vary by trial and time point, often falling in the 20 to 40% range within the first few weeks to months. These figures are markedly higher than remission outcomes in treatment-resistant populations using conventional antidepressants, where single-digit to low-teen percentages are more common. Crucially, those figures come from tightly screened trial populations. Participants were selected and excluded for safety reasons, so results in broader, unselected populations may differ. For those who do respond, the changes are often described as sudden rather than gradual. Therapists working with participants note that patients frequently report feeling unstuck, as if long-standing rumination has loosened its grip. Clinical timelines reinforce this. Where medications often take 6 weeks or more to show benefit, patients with psilocybin frequently report major changes within days of a single session. That speed is especially valuable in clinical contexts, where time is critical and the risks of continued depression are severe. Still, not all outcomes are lasting. Some participants improve for weeks, but then regress by 3 months. Others report no benefit at any stage. A smaller fraction describe destabilizing reactions, such as heightened anxiety or resurfacing of unresolved trauma, which require further intervention. These differences highlight that psilocybin is a strong addition to the treatment landscape, but not a universal cure. Its role is best understood as a new pathway for some, rather than as a sweeping replacement for existing methods. The scale of recent research underscores growing confidence in these findings. Between 2020 and 2025, international teams have launched trials with hundreds of participants, tracked across multiple hospitals and universities. Importantly, many of these projects now include follow-up periods of 6 to 12 months. Results show that, while some individuals relapse, others maintain relief long after the session itself. Those with extended improvements are often the same participants who engage deeply in post-session integration, working with therapists to translate their experiences into daily strategies. This factor suggests psilocybin is not simply a drug acting in isolation. It functions as part of a combined psychological process. One striking feature is dosage frequency. Unlike routine antidepressant use, which often requires daily compliance for years, psilocybin trials frequently employ only 1 or 2 monitored sessions. This brevity in dosing combined with lasting impact challenges long-standing assumptions in psychiatry. Researchers are investigating whether psilocybin operates more like a catalyst, triggering changes in brain networks that outlive the chemical itself. Evidence for neuroplasticity supports this view, though more work is needed to understand why these effects stabilize in some patients but fade in others. It is also significant that regulatory agencies remain cautious. Trial protocols exclude individuals at high risk for psychosis or unstable psychiatric states. They also screen for potential medication interactions that could cause adverse reactions. As a result, the most compelling numbers belong to populations specifically chosen for safety, not to the entire spectrum of people who experience depression in daily life. The field recognizes this gap, and scaling beyond carefully defined conditions will require careful thought and close oversight. Even with limitations, the progression from pilot projects to robust, multi-site data is remarkable. 15 years ago, the studies were small enough to be dismissed as curiosities. Now in 2025, the evidence indicates that under structured conditions, psilocybin therapy can help a significant portion of people even when other antidepressants have failed. For families and clinicians facing previously immovable symptoms, the possibility of sustained remission after a handful of guided sessions represents a potential turning point in psychiatric care. At the same time, researchers remain deliberate in how they frame the story. The question of durability must be addressed with longer longitudinal data. What looks like a breakthrough for a few months may not always extend to a year or beyond. Scientists caution that the excitement must be balanced with patience and an understanding of limits. But what cannot be ignored is the scale of the effect. Remission rates higher than typical medications in one of the toughest patient groups to treat. That basic fact drives continued global interest in psilocybin's therapeutic value. Taken together, the 2025 numbers point to an intervention that is not perfect, but is genuinely different. The combination of rapid relief, relatively high remission rates, and minimal dosing frequency sets psilocybin apart from the long-standing categories of antidepressant treatment. Where it fits in the broader landscape of psychiatry has yet to be formally defined. What is clear is that the story no longer belongs only to depression. Researchers are extending the same cautious protocols into other psychiatric conditions, testing whether the same ability to reconfigure networks might help where other interventions have repeatedly failed. Not just depression, addiction and anxiety outcomes. Could the same compound showing promise in depression also reshape the treatment of addiction and anxiety? That question is drawing growing attention in 2025, and the early evidence suggests psilocybin may extend its reach well beyond mood disorders. Instead of acting like a typical drug that targets cravings or anxiety directly, psilocybin seems to work by disrupting rigid mental patterns and helping patients rethink the meaning behind their behaviors. When paired with therapy, this opens up possibilities for tackling challenges like smoking, alcohol dependence, and even end-of-life anxiety in ways other approaches have struggled to match. Smoking cessation has long remained one of the toughest targets in public health. Nicotine is highly addictive and deeply tied to daily routines, which makes relapse common even when people use gum, patches, or prescription medications. Psilocybin trials approached the problem from another angle. Volunteers entered carefully prepared sessions that combined the psychedelic experience with structured psychological therapy. Instead of simply trying to suppress cravings, therapists worked with participants to explore why smoking had become ingrained in their identity and life narrative. Early trials for smoking dependence have shown unusually high quit rates in small samples when psilocybin was combined with targeted psychotherapy. Some studies reported very high abstinence at intermediate follow-ups, but samples were small and results remain preliminary. For instance, small clinical work in smoking cessation reported very high abstinence for many participants months after dosing. However, these studies had limited sample sizes and require replication before generalized claims can be made. The mechanism may be what sets psilocybin apart. Researchers propose psilocybin's effectiveness in addiction may stem from its ability to interrupt entrenched reward-seeking patterns and enable a reappraisal of the behavior in psychotherapy, rather than by directly suppressing cravings through classic pharmacologic means. Participants frequently describe their change in perspective not as forcing themselves to resist the urge, but as realizing at a deeper level that they no longer wish to smoke. This sense of reframing has proven compelling, though trials are still small and caution remains necessary. Alcohol dependence trials reinforce this possibility. Alcohol is entwined with culture and routine in ways that make reduction difficult, and most therapies must be sustained over long periods with only moderate effect. Psilocybin-assisted therapy has been tested in closely monitored settings with individuals seeking to reduce harmful drinking. Many participants reported profound insights during sessions. Some described confronting old wounds. Others said they felt they could step outside the cycle that had seemed inescapable before. Consistent patterns show reductions in drinking that last for weeks or months beyond the dosing session. The outcomes suggest that when psilocybin is paired with careful guidance, the sense of transformative change endures longer than the chemical itself. Once again, however, researchers emphasize that these are early findings. The reports are promising but not definitive, and further replication is needed before declaring broad treatment potential. These kinds of studies highlight a central theme. Therapy is never considered optional. While psilocybin may open a window of cognitive and emotional flexibility, It is the therapeutic guidance that helps participants construct new patterns they can carry into daily life. Without that support, the destabilization of old routines may not hold, or worse, could cause difficulties. That balance reflects why addiction researchers see psilocybin as a potential catalyst, not a cure-all. Anxiety is another front where psilocybin has generated attention, particularly in patients facing terminal illness. For those at the end of life, the heaviest burden is often not physical pain, but overwhelming existential fear, loss of control, dread of death, and collapse of meaning. Standard medications offer sedation, but rarely diminish the core distress, while talk therapy alone can be insufficient. Psilocybin trials with this group have delivered notable outcomes. Under therapeutic supervision, participants frequently report a marked easing of fear and an ability to approach mortality with greater acceptance. Testimonies from patients and clinical results across multiple institutions highlight consistent reductions in anxiety. Therapists describe the effect less as denial and more as a reframing of mortality that allows people to live out their remaining time with deeper calm. The evidence is strong enough that psilocybin is now considered by many researchers as one of the most promising interventions available for existential anxiety. The future of addiction treatment with psilocybin also points toward opioids, where the challenges are even greater. Unlike smoking or alcohol, the opioid crisis has devastated communities and strained health systems worldwide. Established treatments like methadone and buprenorphine stabilize people by maintaining a controlled dependence, but relapses remain frequent. Early trial results with psilocybin-supported therapy offer a different direction. Participants report reduced cravings and, more importantly, describe alterations in how they perceive their relationship to opioids. Some say the sessions allowed them to confront trauma underlying use, while others note that they felt a loosening of the compulsive grip that opioids had on their thinking. These are early-stage findings with very limited scale, but they hint that psilocybin may offer more than substitution. It may open a path toward authentic disengagement from dependence. Across smoking, alcohol, opioids, and end-of-life anxiety, a similar thread appears. Psilocybin does not act as a simple biochemical fix. It opens networks in the brain, loosens habitual routes of thought, and gives individuals a rare opportunity to reconsider entrenched patterns with support. Therapy then helps translate that temporary state into lasting reorganization. The effect is not guaranteed, and results vary, but some outcomes have been striking enough to keep research expanding despite the careful regulatory gatekeeping. At the same time, clinicians remain firm in emphasizing boundaries. Trials are early, results are promising but not definitive. Clinicians emphasize therapy plus controlled settings and warn against assuming psilocybin alone is a substitute for established addiction care. Some participants relapse, some achieve only partial improvements, and others find the psychedelic experience destabilizing. Without the safety of preparation, trained supervision, and integration afterward, the same loosening of rigid mental structures that aids recovery can overwhelm and trigger new difficulties. What makes this research compelling is not that psilocybin cures addiction or anxiety outright, but that it challenges older models of treatment. Instead of seeing these issues as only chemical imbalances to medicate or failures of individual will, the studies suggest they arise within networks of memory, behavior, and meaning. By altering those networks, psilocybin-assisted therapy provides an opening to reframe how people relate to cravings or fears. That potential has already shifted scientific discussion away from replacement and suppression models toward ones that focus on identity, values, and perspective. Still, questions remain about scale, safety, and long-term durability. How far can these promising signals extend when trials widen beyond small, selected samples? Will the early remission and abstinence rates hold over years? Such concerns remind us that optimism must be grounded in caution. The field is advancing, but no one claims to have a simple answer yet. The implications, however, are real. If depression, addiction, and anxiety all respond in some individuals to carefully framed psilocybin sessions, it suggests a broader principle: that certain forms of mental suffering may involve loops of cognition and emotion that remain inaccessible to conventional therapies. Psilocybin, with its disruptive push against those loops, makes change possible where little hope once existed. Yet the same forces that create breakthroughs carry risks that cannot be brushed aside. The destabilization of rigid mental frameworks is powerful, but it is also unpredictable. Addiction research shows the benefit when the shift is steered constructively. The next question is what unfolds when those shifts go awry in ways patients, or even therapists, cannot control. The risks no one can gloss over. If psilocybin can open doors to change, it can also expose people to dangers that are easy to underestimate. This is why scientists often stress that enthusiasm must be matched by caution, because the risks are not hypothetical. While psilocybin has earned a reputation for being physically safe and non-addictive, the real hazards lie in its psychological effects, and these carry consequences that can be just as serious as physical harm. The very feature that makes the compound potentially therapeutic, its disruption of entrenched mental patterns, also means it can destabilize fragile balances in ways that may overwhelm. The clearest risks appear during acute reactions to the psychedelic state itself. Some participants experience surges of panic when heightened connectivity generates more sensory and emotional input than they can process. Anxiety can escalate into self-reinforcing loops, each new wave of fear amplifying the next. In other cases, paranoia surfaces without warning. A casual glance or ambient sound may suddenly feel menacing, sending the mind into spiraling interpretations of threat. Episodes of profound dissociation are also possible. For some, detachment from self or surroundings feels expansive. For others, it brings unbearable alienation, as if the foundations of reality have fractured apart. While casually labeled bad trips, clinicians view these states more accurately as acute psychological crises. There is also a deeper risk profile that extends beyond the hours of intoxication. Psilocybin is not thought to create psychiatric illness where none existed, but it can expose vulnerabilities. Trials systematically exclude individuals with personal or first-degree family history of psychosis or bipolar disorder because evidence shows agonist stimulation of 5-HT2A can unmask or exacerbate psychotic symptoms in vulnerable people. For someone predisposed to schizophrenia, destabilization during and after a session could act as a trigger for sustained symptoms. Likewise, individuals with bipolar disorder face a risk of being shifted into manic states that may prove difficult to stabilize afterward. It is for these reasons that screening for family history and psychiatric vulnerabilities is a consistent rule in contemporary research. Medication interactions add another layer of complexity. Many patients seeking treatment already take SSRIs or related antidepressants. The overlap poses two issues. First, SSRIs often blunt the subjective and therapeutic effects of psilocybin, so that the intended intervention may have little impact. Second, overlapping effects on serotonin pathways raise theoretical risks of complications. Clinical protocols address this by requiring a supervised taper or washout period from SSRIs when it can be done safely. While true serotonin syndrome is not a routine outcome with psilocybin alone, the concern about interactions is serious enough that trials do not proceed unless medication status is carefully monitored. Without those precautions, experimenting outside a research setting runs risks many users would not anticipate. When panic or paranoia does emerge, trained facilitators play a central role in limiting the potential for lasting harm. Acute panic and paranoia can occur. Trained facilitators use grounding, reassurance, and carefully staged interventions to prevent physical harm and reduce the risk of long-term psychological fallout. Without such support, the storm of fear can escalate until individuals take unsafe actions, running away in confusion or harming themselves in an attempt to end the unbearable sensations. Even if physical harm is avoided, such crises can leave persistent aftereffects, including nightmares, anxious rumination, or intrusive memories. Not all problems present in dramatic form. Some arrive subtly after the trip is over. Intrusive recalls, fleeting but vivid fragments of the psychedelic experience, can surface unpredictably, eroding the stability of daily life. Though not the same as traumatic flashbacks, they can unsettle individuals who are unprepared for their recurrence. More rarely, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder is documented, with visual distortions continuing long after the drug has cleared the system. These outcomes are uncommon, but not dismissible. They remind researchers why systematic monitoring continues long beyond the acute session. Broad safety profiles help clarify what psilocybin is and is not. Large reviews and pooled trial data indicate psilocybin is non-addictive and has low toxicity at clinical doses, but transient adverse effects, such as heightened anxiety, nausea, and elevated blood pressure, are common. Rare reports of increased suicidal ideation and delayed adverse psychological events have also been documented and are monitored across trials. These findings underscore a paradox. Psilocybin does not appear to damage organs or drive compulsive use, but the risks it carries are concentrated in the most delicate domain of all, the mind. Unlike a physical wound, psychological destabilization may not be visible, and recovery paths can be unclear and prolonged. The challenges extend to the timing of sessions. People currently experiencing acute grief, untreated PTSD, or active psychological instability may not be suitable candidates. Psilocybin has the power to unearth deeply emotional material, and for someone already overwhelmed, this release can re-traumatize instead of relieve. Clinical reports confirm that sessions which feel liberating for one person may feel destructive for another depending on preparation and support. That is why structured screening, preparation meetings, and integration follow UPS are treated as non-negotiable elements of responsible protocols. Even among those without underlying vulnerabilities, environment plays a decisive role. A dose taken in a disorganized or unsafe setting can rapidly tilt into confusion or sustained fear. An individual becomes overwhelmed, lacking the external cues to ground their experience. In such scenarios, neutral stimuli can become cemented as future anxiety triggers. What could have been a period of exploration instead settles into trauma. Psilocybin does not generate insight on its own. It amplifies whatever mental state and external context already exist. Researchers emphasize that acknowledging these risks is not intended to discourage investigation. Rather, it brings balance to a conversation that too often focuses on promise while neglecting peril. For some participants in trials, psilocybin truly delivers profound relief. For others, destabilization dominates and recovery requires additional care. Both outcomes come from the same chemical acting under different conditions. Unsupervised use shifts likelihood toward hazard. Supervised use does not eliminate risk, but sets boundaries to catch and contain harm. This nuanced truth is reflected in how the scientific community frames psilocybin today. Your liver and cardiovascular system are not the weak points. It is the brain's narrative machinery, memory systems, and sense of self that are most vulnerable. Conventional medications shift chemistry in small increments over time. Psilocybin initiates rapid change in a matter of hours. Those dramatic adjustments are precisely what make it powerful, and also why fallout is possible. It is this duality, of immense promise shadowed by genuine risk, that prevents researchers from presenting a one-sided picture. Recognizing those risks also points toward the next question researchers ask. If the likelihood of harm is so closely tied to circumstances, then what specific factors separate destabilization from healing? That question leads directly to one of the most critical insights from psychedelic research over the past decade. It is not just the drug that matters, but the conditions under which it is taken. Why the setting defines the outcome. Why does a dose of psilocybin in a calm medical setting often feel like progress, while that same dose in a chaotic environment can collapse into confusion? Researchers point to one principle again and again: set and setting. This phrase sounds simple, but it captures the strongest variable in how psilocybin is experienced. Unlike many drugs that produce predictable effects regardless of context, psilocybin amplifies whatever is already present, both internally and externally. That means mindset and environment are not side notes. They define the shape of the journey. Set refers to mindset. If someone begins anxious, distracted, or uncertain, those feelings expand outward under psilocybin until they flood the entire session. If the same person enters prepared, calm, supported, and open, the amplifier effect magnifies trust and curiosity instead. Setting refers to surroundings, the room, lighting, sound, and people present. Lying comfortably with eye shades in a quiet space, with trusted guides nearby, channels the session towards safety. In contrast, a noisy environment or unpredictable crowd sends the mind into defensive mode, where neutral details can quickly feel threatening. And just as critical is a third ingredient often overlooked outside research: integration. The process of returning later to discuss what was experienced and translate fleeting images into practical meaning. Put simply, set equals mindset, prepared with therapy and expectation setting. Setting equals environment. Clinical spaces use 2 trained guides, calm lighting, and curated music, and integration equals post-session therapy to anchor the changes. Without all 3, the experience often unravels into confusion instead of closing into insight. That prioritization of context explains why clinical trials build entire frameworks around the psychedelic session, not just the dose itself. Participants speak one-on-one with therapists for days or weeks beforehand, rehearsing scenarios they might encounter. Unexpected fear, emotional release, or vivid memories. These preparatory conversations help frame difficulty as part of the process rather than as failure. Then, during the dosing day itself, 2 professionally trained facilitators stay present throughout. They rarely intrude, but their very presence ensures that when destabilization occurs, as it often does, it has a supportive safety net. The therapy room itself is crafted for predictability. Neutral decor, soft lighting that never abruptly changes, and carefully sequenced playlists chosen for the emotional arcs of the session. This level of care seems excessive until you remember psilocybin amplifies sensitivity to every external cue. Even a sudden door slam or harsh word could spiral the mind into paranoia if safeguards are absent. Contrast this with unsupervised use. A person swallowing the same dose at a crowded party may enter with no preparation, immersed in overstimulation, and without any plan for integrating what might surface. In that environment, psilocybin latches onto unpredictability and pushes it further. Stray laughter might become evidence of conspiracy. A pounding bassline may feel like it is controlling thought itself. What would have been a guided opportunity for calm reflection becomes instead a chaotic surge of overwhelming impressions. The chemical is unchanged. The difference lies entirely in the surrounding framework. For that reason, researchers argue that psilocybin cannot be evaluated like a pill. It is a catalyst whose trajectory depends on the architecture you build around it. Preparation itself proves to be more than just psychological comfort. Data from trials show that participants who attended structured preparatory meetings are more likely to experience lasting therapeutic benefit. They report fewer acute panic episodes and fewer difficulties integrating their experiences afterward. In contrast, those who arrive without expectations or who resist the preparatory process often struggle more during the altered state. The pre-session work acts not just as reassurance, but as a mental toolkit. When confusion rises, participants can rely on learned strategies to stabilize themselves. This distinction explains why supervised dosing continues to outperform unsupervised use, even in the absence of large dosage differences. Integration afterward is equally decisive. Without it, visions may remain confusing and potentially destabilizing. After clinical sessions, patients meet with therapists to recount what happened, whether emotional release, surreal imagery, or sudden recollections. Those encounters are treated not as entertainment, but as symbolic material to connect to daily life. A powerful vision of loss might be reframed into motivation to reconcile with family. A frightening memory recalled may be unpacked into a manageable therapy goal. Without such structured unpacking, people often struggle with lingering fragments and do not translate the session into actionable growth. In this way, integration completes the therapeutic loop. Psilocybin may open mental doors, but therapy after the fact decides which ones remain open and which close. Ethnographic records add an illuminating parallel. Traditional ceremonial uses rarely unfolded without structure. They often included music, ritual preparation, fasting, trusted guides, and shared meaning-making afterward. Across regions, patterns emerge showing that cultures develop safeguards not unlike those in present-day trials. Ethnographic evidence and modern trials converge on the same insight. Ritualized preparation and trusted guides reduce harm and amplify beneficial outcomes. Today, what was once symbolic ritual has become clinical protocol, but the underlying principle, support plus context equals safety and meaning, remains consistent. The metaphor of environment is sharpest through contrast. A person reclined in calm space, supported by guides and gentle music, often reports clarity and release. The same dose swallowed on a noisy dance floor, surrounded by strangers, often yields paranoia or panic. The comparison showcases that psilocybin is less "what drug did you take" than "what world did you step into while taking it." That is why researchers emphasize that environment is not a detail to be polished later. It is the very mechanism channeling the drug into either constructive or destabilizing patterns. Some critics argue that if psilocybin really possesses therapeutic potential, the chemical alone should do the work regardless of setting. Neuroscientists respond sharply. Psilocybin does not function like antibiotics or painkillers, which act predictably across contexts. Its effects occur at the level of perception and cognition, which depend on active interaction with environment. A sterile analogy is comparing it to music. The composition may be written identically each time, but performance defines how the audience receives it. Likewise, psilocybin provides the neural potential, while environment and mindset dictate whether that potential resolves as harmony or dissonance. One reason modern trials design every detail so intentionally is because psilocybin magnifies attention to small changes. Lighting, tone of voice, casual background noises, neutral stimuli in ordinary circumstances can dominate the altered perception. For this reason, even small elements are scripted. Therapists trained not to rush speech, curtains drawn to avoid sudden sunlight shifts, phones silenced. While participants report gratitude for these conditions at the time, later analysis shows that the apparent small details were often remembered as pivotal. This sensitivity explains both psilocybin's therapeutic promise and its risk when such details are not managed. Researchers phrase it bluntly: psilocybin magnifies openness, vulnerability, and meaning-making. Managed carefully, this can help break depression, reduce addiction, or soften anxiety. Managed poorly, the same openness can harden into trauma or distress. The chemical itself allows access, but the surrounding structure decides direction. That is why preparation, environment, and integration are not add-ons but structural supports. Without them, psilocybin is less a therapy than a gamble. Understanding set and setting as the gateway to outcomes also reframes how we think about psilocybin research more generally. Successes are not evidence of a standalone pill, but of a carefully choreographed system. Failures are not proof the chemical is worthless, but that the framework collapsed. In both directions, context dictates meaning. And that realization shifts the research focus toward ensuring safe frameworks, rather than chasing only chemical refinements. With the importance of context established, another question follows naturally. If setting shapes how psilocybin feels in the moment, what remains long after the session ends? Does the experience echo in the brain in ways that persist for months? Or does it vanish completely once the molecule is gone? Those unknowns define one of the most consequential frontiers in psychedelic research today. Long-term effects and the big unknowns. What remains in the mind long after psilocybin has left the body is where many of the most important questions converge. Unlike most psychoactive compounds, which wear off within hours and leave little trace beyond memory of the experience, psilocybin seems capable of leaving lasting impressions on personality, mood, and cognition. Some studies tracking participants months after supervised sessions have reported sustained changes in thought patterns and outlook. These findings are both promising and uncertain, because while they suggest sharply different possibilities from conventional medication, their durability and generalizability remain under active investigation. One outcome that has drawn attention is the apparent rise in psychological openness following structured sessions. In personality research, openness is linked with curiosity, creativity, and flexibility in perspective. Normally, personality traits in adults are stable across years or decades and shift only slowly. That is why reports of significant increases in openness after supervised psilocybin sessions stand out. Some controlled studies and follow-ups have reported sustained increases in openness and other well-being measures lasting months to a year after supervised sessions. These effects are notable because personality traits are typically stable, but findings vary by study and are still under investigation. In daily life, participants have described this change as a renewed ability to explore interests they had long set aside, or to re-engage with relationships that felt emotionally inaccessible prior to treatment. Changes in rumination are another recurring theme. Depression often operates through rigid patterns of self-criticism and repetitive thought. Psilocybin, when combined with structured therapy, appears to disrupt these loops. Some follow-ups show that participants months later describe the ability to observe difficult thoughts without being absorbed by them. Imaging studies lend support, showing altered connectivity in networks involved in self-reflection and emotional regulation. Though these modifications do not necessarily last indefinitely, their persistence beyond the acute period suggests windows of extended neuroplasticity. Windows that, if guided effectively, may support healthier patterns of thought. Open-label follow-ups and smaller pilot studies have reported lasting reductions in depression and improved functioning out to 3 to 12 months in some cohorts. But many of these studies are open-label or small and require larger randomized long-term trials for firm conclusions. At the same time, the persistence of effects raises caution. Not every long-term change proves beneficial. For some, fragments of intense imagery or emotional content reappear as unwanted intrusions, transient flashback, like experiences or distortions. These can interrupt daily functioning, even if they do not rise to clinical emergencies. Rare cases involve hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, where visual disturbances or perceptual shifts return intermittently long after use. Less severe but still disruptive effects include heightened sensitivity to light, sleep disturbance, or lingering anxiety. These complications are much less common than therapeutic reports, but underline that psilocybin can leave lasting traces in either direction. The same property, enhanced neural adaptability, that opens opportunities for change also carries the risk of reinforcing unresolved problems. The challenge, as researchers emphasize, is that we currently lack precise tools to predict outcomes in advance. Family psychiatric history provides some safety markers, and this is why people prone to psychosis or bipolar disorder are systematically excluded from clinical trials. Beyond such screens, though, predictions are limited. Currently, there are no precise biomarkers that predict who will have lasting benefit versus who will struggle post-session. Screening and integration remain the primary clinical safeguards. Two participants may enter similar protocols with comparable histories, yet one reports sustained relief months later, while the other experiences destabilizing echoes. The unpredictability is a defining feature of long-term psilocybin outcomes and one of the largest unknowns facing clinical science today. Context continues to matter long after the session ends. Integration therapy plays a large role in whether these extended effects lean toward growth or difficulty. A participant who feels supported and who reframes experiences in therapy may harness openness into meaningful behavior change. One who lacks that framework can spiral into confusion, constructing troubling narratives around the same destabilizing material. This dual potential highlights a central theme. Psilocybin is neither universally healing nor inherently harmful. Like the acute effects themselves, the long-term consequences are mediated by the structure around them. At the biological level, neuroplasticity is thought to underpin these extended changes. Psilocybin appears to promote transient periods when neural circuits reorganize more readily than usual. This plasticity may allow new regulatory patterns to interrupt entrenched loops of depression or soften the conditioned responses that lock people into addictive cycles. But plasticity itself is a neutral property. When guided poorly, it can cement maladaptive routes. Long-standing fears, traumatic responses, or unhealthy patterns may become stronger precisely because the brain is unusually prepared to adopt new connections. This duality, adaptive and maladaptive plasticity, is what makes psilocybin powerful but also unpredictable. Time frame is another dimension where clarity is absent. Some participants report benefits, greater openness, reduced rumination, improved mood, lasting more than a year. Others note improvements fading within several weeks. Certain individuals not only lose benefits, but also develop challenges that endure over similar spans of time. Without longitudinal studies tracking larger groups across years, science cannot yet determine consistent timelines. What is clear is that psilocybin stands apart from most psychiatric drugs. Its footprint remains detectable long after the molecule has cleared from the body. Flashback-like phenomena underscore this complexity. Visual distortions, brief memory compressions, or shifts in sensory perception have been reported as late as months post-session. These are not widespread, but because they can cause distress, especially when unexpected, they remain an area of focus. Researchers debate whether such outcomes are intrinsic to psilocybin or correlated with pre-existing vulnerabilities in perception or anxiety regulation. What is uncontested is that psilocybin introduces a durable quality of uncertainty uncommon in typical psychiatric medicine. Antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs lose their effect once discontinued. Psilocybin sessions can establish consequences, good or bad, that far outlast measurable concentrations in blood or brain. This enduring potential could open new treatment strategies, but also compels strict caution. Advocates highlight single-dose or limited session schedules producing relief where years of conventional medication failed. Critics underscore the lack of control over downstream effects, especially outside structured environments. Both perspectives are valid, because psilocybin holds the potential for life-changing renewal or troubling instability, depending on variables science cannot yet fully map. For this reason, researchers often describe psilocybin not as a standalone medicine, but as a catalyst. The compound destabilizes entrenched patterns and primes the brain for reorganization. What follows, the building of healthier habits or the entrenchment of maladaptive responses, depends on support and context. A single guided session can trigger sustained recovery. A single mismanaged session can ripple outward into months of challenge. What remains consistent is that psilocybin cannot be treated as a neutral or predictable intervention. Its power comes packaged with uncertainty. Framed this way, the most significant unknowns are not only clinical, but societal. If psilocybin's long-term effects hold such potential alongside real unpredictability, then the stakes for responsible use extend beyond medicine. They raise questions of access, safeguards, and oversight, not only how these experiences unfold in the clinic, but how they will be managed once the compound moves into broader awareness and availability. That next step, the handling of psilocybin outside research environments, is shaping into one of the most debated dimensions of its future. Legal status and the 2025 landscape. Is psilocybin on the verge of becoming a regulated part of medicine rather than something confined to underground use? That possibility, once dismissed outright, has become a legitimate debate point in 2025. Regulators, policymakers, and medical researchers are now grappling with whether to authorize use under certain conditions. The legal map at this moment is uneven, but the direction of movement is clear enough to reshape how governments and health systems think about psychedelic medicine. What was once relegated to counterculture circles now appears on international agendas and in medical discussions. Still, global legal status remains patchy in 2025. Psilocybin remains Schedule 1 federally in the US, yet the FDA has granted expedited designations to psilocybin research. In parallel, some US states and cities have created local regulatory frameworks, decriminalization in municipalities, and regulated programs in Oregon and Colorado. Australia has allowed tightly controlled medical access under the Therapeutic Goods Administration for certain psychiatric conditions, while Canada has expanded its exemptions process. Several European countries have pursued expanding research programs and limited clinical allowances. Together, this mosaic shows a shift toward cautious medical legitimacy, though boundaries still vary sharply based on location. Australia's early decision in 2023 set a historic precedent. By allowing psychiatrists to prescribe psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression under strict oversight, it signaled a willingness to move beyond prohibition toward medical control. Other countries took note. In Canada, exemptions granted for psilocybin-assisted therapy continue to grow, and discussions of broader medical access have reached federal regulators. Europe reflects a fragmented but expanding landscape, with individual nations authorizing medical research and specialized trials intended to inform eventual psychiatric approvals. These policies stop well short of open legalization, but they chart a steady pathway toward grounded clinical acceptance. The United States embodies the tension more sharply. At the federal level, psilocybin still sits on the list of substances officially considered to have no accepted medical use. Yet federal agencies themselves have approved breakthrough therapy status for research programs, giving them expedited review and signaling openness to future approval. This paradox, illegal on paper, essential in practice, defines much of the US's 2025 landscape. Local initiatives have filled the void, creating a patchwork of rules that depend entirely on state or city borders. In Oregon and Colorado, structured programs now allow patients to participate in psilocybin experiences under licensed supervision. In select cities, possession carries no risk of prosecution. But only a short distance away, in other jurisdictions, the same possession still counts as a criminal offense. This unevenness complicates access, creates confusion for patients, and forces providers to operate in a shifting and uncertain regulatory climate. Speculation has increased around the possibility of broader US approval for medical use. The FDA has made public comments indicating that if large-scale trial results continue to replicate early outcomes, formal approval may be possible before 2030. But officials stress that this would not resemble a simple prescription model at retail pharmacies. Regulators who consider approval emphasize clinic models with trained facilitators and strict protocols rather than open prescription models. This is why policy debates focus as much on therapist certification and clinic standards as on the drug itself. In effect, any move toward federal approval would anchor psilocybin within clinical infrastructure, closer to the model seen with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy today. The enthusiasm has drawn pushback from several directions. Regulators continually warn against moving too quickly, pointing to limited long-term data. Critics highlight the risks of releasing psychedelic therapies widely before years of follow-up can confirm safety across diverse populations. Past experiences loom as lessons. Many psychiatric drugs entered the market with broad acclaim, only to later reveal overlooked consequences. Because psilocybin's effects can last far beyond the active chemical window, officials are particularly cautious about unrecognized long-term impacts. The need for moderation, not dismissal or hype, remains the theme. Economic questions add another complication. Unlike ongoing antidepressant regimens, psilocybin therapy requires only one or a few guided sessions, performed with trained support in specialized environments. This model challenges conventional pharmaceutical business structures built around long-term prescriptions. Some companies envision psilocybin clinics operating as specialized centers, more akin to advanced psychiatric interventions than routine pharmacy refills. One practical challenge regulators face is cost and access. Supervised sessions are resource-intensive, so questions remain about who will pay and how to scale safely. If therapy depends on multiple trained staff and carefully crafted environments, widespread availability will require careful funding models to avoid creating treatments accessible only to those who can afford high out-of-pocket costs. Ketamine provides a comparison point, and one that policymakers frequently cite. Once seen as only a dissociative anesthetic, ketamine has been repositioned as a mood treatment under strict clinical supervision. Clinics offering sessions now operate widely, but they carry steep costs and inconsistent regulation. Advocates for psilocybin treatment point to ketamine to demonstrate what is possible, while skeptics use the same case to caution about inequities and overcommercialization. Psilocybin is unlikely to mirror ketamine exactly, but the precedent shows the obstacles of scaling a psychedelic therapy responsibly within modern health systems. Another layer of complexity lies in legal responsibility. Psychiatric medications such as SSRIs are prescribed with clear guidelines about dosage and chemical mechanisms. If side effects occur, they are attributed directly to the drug. Psilocybin, however, works differently. The outcome of a session depends not only on chemistry, but also on context, environment, and therapist support. This makes regulation more complicated. Approving psilocybin as a medicine also means approving the infrastructure required. Licensing systems for facilitators, training standards for therapists, environmental controls within clinic spaces. Psychedelic medicine forces governments to regulate not just molecules, but entire therapeutic settings. Despite these barriers, the overall trend is forward movement. International conferences in 2025 regularly include panels on psychedelic medicine policy, workshops, and detailed updates on trial outcomes. Regulators now discuss psilocybin alongside established treatments, considering not whether it works, but how access can be structured responsibly. Insurance coverage, ethical frameworks, and therapist training all surface repeatedly as topics of concern. What was fringe now occupies official debate on how to expand mental health care where conventional treatments fall short. Pushback still comes strongly, especially from conservative or religious perspectives that oppose legalized psychedelic use on moral grounds. Public health experts warn of the risks of uncontrolled commercialization, and clinicians caution against letting media hype inflate expectations before data fully supports them. The tension shows that introducing psilocybin cannot rely on science alone. Medical, social, and ethical systems will determine how far it advances. Managing expectations while building careful policy structures is the central challenge facing regulators today. By 2025, the legal status of psilocybin captures a collision between measurable therapeutic promise and long-standing regulatory caution. Governments and agencies are not debating whether psilocybin has potential. That phase has passed. The real task is figuring out how to integrate it without repeating earlier mistakes in psychiatric medicine. Whether it becomes a specialized therapy reserved for last-line treatment, or a future option with more routine availability, depends less on trial results alone, and more on legal, clinical, and economic architecture. Frameworks must manage both access and protection. As the landscape evolves, the promise of accessibility remains closely tied to supervision and carefully structured environments. That leads to a practical question many people ask. For individuals seeking treatment, how do they know whether psilocybin-assisted therapy is something they should consider, or something that could harm more than help? Should you consider psychedelic therapy? With the regulatory picture still in flux, the practical question becomes personal. Should you consider psychedelic therapy for yourself or someone you care about? That decision is not abstract. It depends on safety screenings, mental health status, concurrent medications, and the support structures available before and after a session. Clinical research has demonstrated that psilocybin can provide powerful benefits in the right conditions, but it has also shown the risks when those safeguards aren't in place. This is why professional programs begin with rigorous evaluations long before any dosing occurs. Common exclusion criteria in clinical trials are clear and consistent. People with a personal or first-degree family history of psychotic disorders, such as schizophrenia, are not eligible, since 5-HT stimulation can unmask those conditions. Individuals with uncontrolled bipolar disorder or active mania are also excluded because of the risk of triggering destabilization. Recent medical instability, such as major cardiovascular events, can also be grounds for exclusion. And perhaps most importantly, certain concurrent medications are known to conflict. Many SSRIs and other antidepressants interact with serotonin pathways and can both dull psilocybin's effects and increase the chance of complications. For that reason, participants in research trials often follow supervised taper or washout plans before being enrolled. Trials also require evidence of psychological readiness and robust support systems, along with clear plans for integration sessions that continue after the psychedelic state ends. These restrictions are not formalities, they are safety barriers. Screening helps protect people who might face greater risks from the destabilization psilocybin brings. Outside official studies, these checks are rarely performed, and someone could move forward without realizing they fall into a high-risk category. For this reason, most clinical teams explain to applicants up front that many adults with depression or anxiety may not qualify, not because psilocybin has no potential for them, but because safety must come first. If someone does make it past the screening process, the structure of the program remains just as important. Trials do not treat the dosing session as a standalone event. Before the day of dosing, participants complete preparatory meetings with therapists to clarify expectations and explore possible emotional content that could surface. This work ensures that if difficult feelings emerge, the individual is less likely to be blindsided. During the session itself, at least 2 trained facilitators stay present and attentive throughout. Participants usually wear eye shades and listen to carefully selected music while being monitored continuously. After the psychedelic effects fade, multiple integration sessions follow, where the experiences are examined and translated into therapeutic strategies. If someone is considering therapy, it is vital to ask whether the program offers all of these elements. Preparatory sessions, at-dose supervision by 2 trained facilitators, and structured post-session integration. Programs aligned with research protocols always include them. Integration deserves particular emphasis. The heightened awareness and intense imagery that arise under psilocybin can feel profound in the moment, but without structured processing afterward, those impressions risk remaining as mere novelty or confusion. In integration therapy, facilitators help the participant find meaning in what was felt or seen, connecting those experiences to concrete changes in behavior, perspective, or relationships. A difficult vision, reframed in discussion, can become a motivation for healing rather than a lingering fear. Integration increases the chance that the benefits last long beyond the chemical window. Without it, many of the gains observed in trials would evaporate. Readiness itself is not a passive trait. Trials make clear that participants who enter expecting an instant solution often struggle the most. Readiness means approaching the process as a partnership, being willing to sit with discomfort, engage in therapy beyond the session, and translate experiences into action. Psilocybin does not automatically deliver insights that stay intact when the drug wears off. It can amplify awareness, but the patient must then do the ongoing work of embedding those shifts into everyday life. This requirement sets psychedelic therapy apart from conventional psychiatric medication, where the patient's involvement is often reduced to taking a daily pill. With psilocybin, the patient's mindset and follow-through directly shape whether the outcome is helpful or destabilizing. That distinction also highlights the hazards of self-medication. The trial's safety and efficacy depend on screening and supervised integration. Self-administering psilocybin outside that framework increases psychological risks documented in the literature and is discouraged. People attempting it on their own risk, skipping exclusions for psychiatric vulnerabilities, combining the substance with incompatible medications, or using unsafe dosages. Even if the experience feels positive in the moment, the absence of preparation and follow-up makes lasting benefits less likely. Worse, destabilization without support can extend harm well after the drug has cleared. Researchers repeatedly emphasize that psilocybin should not be seen as a casual remedy or a shortcut. Its potential is real, but it emerges only when the entire structured framework is in place. The enthusiasm built around psilocybin therapy can make it tempting to see it as an opportunity open to all. Hundreds of headlines emphasize the speed of relief, the reports of lasting impact, and the novelty of a single-dose treatment. But beneath those headlines lies a quieter reality. Not every participant qualifies, not every result endures, and the safety net of professional guidance is not optional. The gap between clinical outcomes and unsupervised use is wide. Knowing that difference is what separates care from gambling. Anyone considering psychedelic therapy should treat the decision with serious intent. That means reviewing health history honestly with medical professionals, complying with screening requirements, tapering off medications only under supervision, and preparing for the integration process as much as the trip itself. Programs that skip these steps are cutting against the foundation that makes psilocybin therapy effective in the first place. By contrast, when these safeguards are fully respected, participants have a significantly greater chance of achieving real, lasting improvements. To understand psilocybin as a potential therapy is therefore to understand the conditions that make it safe and useful. Screening is non-negotiable. Supervision is essential. Integration is what completes the process. Without these elements, the psychedelic state easily collapses into confusion or unresolved emotion. With them, the same intensity can become a pivot point that contributes to renewed stability and relief. Recognizing that duality, promise and risk held together, is crucial for anyone weighing the choice. From this perspective, psilocybin therapy represents neither an automatic opportunity nor a reckless danger. It is a structured practice that can bring benefit when used with precision and caution, and harm when stripped of those boundaries. Deciding whether to consider it means looking beyond the hype and into the specific criteria that research programs apply every day. For those who meet them, the process can be a powerful catalyst. For those who do not, it may be unsafe. That distinction remains the most important answer to the question of whether psychedelic therapy is truly an option. Understanding that balance also frames how we think about psilocybin more broadly. It is not defined by miracle or menace, but by the conditions surrounding its use. What infrastructure exists, what safeguards are kept, and how each individual is prepared. With that in mind, the conversation naturally turns to a final, larger perspective. What role psilocybin should play in society, and how we choose to define it for the future. Psilocybin now stands as one of the most closely studied compounds in modern psychiatric research, framed by both its promise and its risks. It is neither an automatic cure nor an inevitable danger. It is a clinical tool, and like all tools, its value depends entirely on preparation, context, and guidance. The science shows it can amplify thought, soften rigid patterns, and reshape perspective. It can just as easily intensify anxiety, confusion, or fear if used carelessly. Psilocybin is a powerful clinical tool with real promise when delivered within careful, therapist-led protocols. It's not a miracle or a menace, but a potent amplifier of what already exists in mind and environment. If you're curious, learn about legitimate clinical trials, or talk with a licensed psychiatrist rather than experimenting on your own.